Sanctions collapse control. The Russian system is cracking. Putin may dodge peace talks, but the UK and EU are ready to strike with new sanctions. His army falling apart with recruitment at a 2-year low. His economy bleeding with a $54 billion deficit and growing. And now they want to ban phones for kids. Too much Western truth, they say. Welcome to Ukraine Today. I'm Zurislava Kolesnikova, and today we're exposing how Russia is sinking deeper into fear, failure and total control. Let's get into the truth they don't want you to hear. The UK and European Union are preparing a new wave of sanctions against Russia, but only if Putin refuses to sit down with President Zelensky. According to The Telegraph, Western leaders are losing patience. Behind the scenes, many doubt the Russian dictator will ever agree to real peace talks. His goal seems clear: not to negotiate, but to keep terrorizing Ukraine's civilian population. What's next if Putin walks away from the table again?
14 people were injured in the Sumy region as a result of a Russian attack. At night, the aggressor launched a massive drone strike on the city of Okturka. Among the injured are 3 children. Residential buildings were damaged.
In Kostiantynivka, Donetsk region, 5 apartment buildings were damaged by a KIB strike. At least 3 people are still trapped under the rubble. The rescue operation is ongoing. There was also a treacherous strike on a gas distribution station in the Odessa region. There were also attacks in the Chernihiv, Kharkiv and Poltava regions. In total, more than 60 drones and a ballistic missile were used. All of these are demonstrative strikes that only confirm the need to put pressure on Moscow, the need to impose new sanctions and tariffs until diplomacy is fully effective. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, on Telegram.
European leaders do not believe that the Kremlin is ready to stop the war against Ukraine, but they support Washington's peace initiatives. The logic is simple. If they work, the war will end. If not, the US president will have no doubt that Putin is bluffing. In that case, Trump will be convinced of the need to tighten sanctions against Russia, Politico summarizes. Meanwhile, as stated in Washington, preparations for a possible meeting between Zelensky and Putin have already begun.
We must remember that Putin can rarely be trusted. Therefore, it still remains to be seen whether he has the courage to attend such a meeting. Does he have the courage to come to a trilateral meeting, or is he just stalling for time again? Of course, if he really is stalling for time, then together we will look for new solutions.
Putin has agreed to negotiations with the president of Ukraine as confirmed by the White House. The proposal to organize a summit was made during a phone conversation between the head of the White House and the Russian dictator.
Well, listen, President Trump discussed this with both leaders and they expressed their willingness to sit down at the negotiating table. So, our national security team will assist both sides in this. Ultimately, the president has always said that there are disagreements in this war that these two countries need to discuss and resolve. And that's why he wants them to engage in direct diplomacy.
According to the New York Times, Putin proposed to Trump to hold the meeting, attention, in Moscow. The American leader politely declined this option.
We can see from Putin's proposal to meet in Moscow that Moscow is actually not interested in being constructive and is trying to buy time and use Trump's desire to ramp up diplomacy and the negotiation track to extract maximum benefits for itself, namely, to stall for time while continuing its offensive on the front and to delay the issue of sanctions.
Washington is looking for other options to hold the summit. And according to Politico, the United States Secret Service is currently considering Budapest as the location for a meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and the Kremlin dictator. However, in Europe, this idea was met with skepticism.
Budapest? Not everyone may remember, but in 1994, Ukraine already received guarantees of territorial integrity from the US, Russia and the UK in Budapest. Maybe I'm superstitious, but this time I would try to find another place. Donald Tusk, Prime Minister of Poland, on social network X.
Geneva is ready to host a Ukraine-Russia summit, said Swiss Foreign Minister Ignacio Cassis. He even promised that the Kremlin dictator would not be arrested under the International Criminal Court's warrant.
The Federal Council has already determined the legal situation. It studied it in detail last year. It established the procedures and rules. It set rules, for example, granting immunity to a person under an international arrest warrant if that person comes to a peace conference not for personal reasons and so on, but for the sake of peace. This is thanks to the efforts of Switzerland and the Geneva International Council.
Another place where Putin is completely safe is Minsk. Belarus has neither signed nor ratified the Rome Statute, which is the founding treaty of the International Criminal Court. Lukashenko's press secretary has already stated, Minsk is ready to host such a meeting. Nikita Skoblikov for Freedom TV channel.
Russia's war machine is running out of systems. The number of new contract soldiers joining the army has dropped to its lowest point in 2 years. Even big money can't convince Russia to fight anymore. Why is this happening now? What does it say about the state of Putin's military, and how could this shift affect the future of the war? All the answers in our full report.
Russians do not want to sign contracts with the occupying army. In the second quarter of 2025, the number of people who signed a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense was the lowest in the past 2 years.
A complex political structure and a pervasive mythology have emerged. This has happened specifically for the Russians themselves, shaping their collective identity and national narrative over time. But this is absolutely and entirely logical, because for several decades, Russians have been consistently fed the pervasive idea that their entire lives are fundamentally built around actively opposing the decaying West. And at the very same time, above all else, the United States, the entire geopolitical construct of Vladimir Putin's regime, was fundamentally built upon a strong opposition to the United States. And now, surprisingly, Putin is happily flying to the United States, meeting with the well-preserved Donald Trump, announcing that there is indeed much to thoroughly discuss, including the crucial Arctic region, possibly valuable rare earths, critical nuclear security issues, and so on. And right before our very eyes, as Putin himself calls them, ordinary Russian citizens. The direction of propaganda growth is shifting course by 180 degrees.
The Russian publication Important Stories reports that the number of contract soldiers has decreased by 2.5 times compared to this time last year.
It's not just that they go to fight and die in Ukraine for, let's say, signing bonuses from contracts. Their wives and mothers are happy when they receive death benefits. Well, everyone has already seen in the videos how that mother with the Priora was celebrating. These are truly horrifying scenes. But at the very same time, it is also true that people often go to fight because that is precisely how pervasive propaganda has effectively shaped and profoundly raised them throughout their lives.
Despite the decrease in the number of signed contracts, the Kremlin continues to lie about the real pace of replenishing the Russian army. For example, Deputy Chairman of the Russian Security Council Dmitry Medvedev claimed that in the first 6 months of 2025, supposedly 210,000 new contracts were signed. This figure is 1.6 times higher than the numbers derived from Russian budget expenditure data analyzed by journalists.
It should be noted that about a quarter, but again, as the SFR reports, this is the so-called, as Russia refers to it, of the number of contract soldiers, this is the so-called special contingent. Who is included in it? These are convicts. These are people who, for example, have been charged, have completed an agreement with the investigator. And in this concept of the special contingent, the Russians also include the forced mobilization of citizens of other countries under various pretexts with different motivations. Some are initially promised work at military enterprises with a lucrative contract. Some are immediately, for example, in countries where the Russian Federation promises big money and people fall for it. Let's put it that way. And in addition, they are also promised Russian citizenship. Some are promised housing.
Despite the decline in mobilization morale, it is still difficult for the Russians to compensate for their losses at the front, but they are managing to do so.
Putin, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't care who is sent into the meat grinder of war to achieve his political goals and ambitions, whether they are, as he calls them, ordinary Russians or just some migrant workers or people who were simply deceived. They are forced to put on a uniform and sent somewhere near Pokrovsky into the forested mines.
Previously, the Russian Federation was able to maintain a positive balance both through Russian contract soldiers and through the so-called special contingent, which made up to a third of all new recruits. After Putin's rapprochement with the United States, against whom the Russians are supposedly fighting in Ukraine, the propaganda paradigms in people's minds are beginning to dissipate. Not even the high signing bonuses paid for joining the Russian army can stop this.
Sanctions, war, and growing dependence on China are dragging Russia into a deep economic hole. Last month alone, the Kremlin's budget deficit hit $13 billion, and since the start of the year, it has ballooned to $54 billion, already exceeding annual projections. Even worse, government spending is rising 9 times faster than revenue. But inside Russia, these problems are hidden from the public. So what's really going on with the Russian economy, and where is this all hidden? Full story next.
The war is costing the Kremlin a fortune. The Russian Federation's budget deficit for the first 7 months of 2025 amounted to $54 billion. This was written on his page by the head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak.
Today, Russia's budget is a bubble. In July alone, the deficit amounted to a staggering $13 billion. From January to July, it reached $54 billion. This is more than the annual expectations. Expenditures have increased by 28% year-on-year. Revenues, on the other hand, only by 2.8%. You can pretend to be Sauron all you want, but when the economy is collapsing because of the war, you're nothing more than a sinful golem, hiding your tattered pocket from the eyes of the whole world.
13 billion rubles is more than the annual expectations. The gap between revenues and expenditures is simply catastrophic. The hole in the budget is big, but not that terrifying, say Russian economists.
The situation is becoming much worse than it was in 2023-24. If in previous years the authorities, although they constantly missed their budget deficit targets, promising 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion rubles, but ending up with a budget hole of 3.5 trillion rubles, then this year the situation has become truly dire. The war has been going on for 3.5 years now. There is a systematic destruction of the civilian sectors of the economy. Dozens of industries have become consistently unprofitable, and there has been a sharp decline in oil and gas revenues. And now we see that just in January through July, in the first 7 months of this year, the budget deficit has already exceeded the entire revised plan for the current year of 4.9 trillion rubles. And just to note, this is 4 times more than what the Ministry of Finance originally planned at the end of last year, when they were adopting the budget for the current year.
Back in the spring, The Economist reported that since the end of 2024, a sharp downturn has been observed in the Russian economy. The downturn came after a period when the Russian economy was showing growth, despite sanctions and the war. This was facilitated by generous budget injections, high commodity prices, and the militarization of the economy.
The high-frequency index, calculated by Goldman Sachs, shows that since the end of last year, Russia's annual GDP growth has dropped from about 5% to nearly zero. WIB, the Russian Development Bank, observes similar trends in its assessment of monthly growth. The business turnover indicator calculated by Sberbank, Russia's largest lender, has declined. The government, though more cautiously, acknowledges that something is happening. In early April, the central bank noted that recently, a number of sectors have seen a decline in production due to a sharp drop in demand.
Despite the figures and expert opinions, Putin has his own view of the budget situation.
As for the federal budget, the situation here is stable.
A couple of weeks ago, he said that all Russians had paid for the war through a surge in prices and a budget deficit. And now he says we will all be reducing military spending. But we see that military spending is actually increasing by 25 to 30% year over year. Next year, it will continue to grow. And accordingly, this means that there will be money printing. The 6th year will be a year of the strictest austerity, that Russians should get ready to tighten their belts to unpopular decisions and to an even more aggressive increase in all kinds of levies, monopoly tariffs, utilities, recycling fees, excises, duties, the failure of entire national projects, budget cuts, reduction in spending on the population, the social sphere, healthcare, and education.
The situation is so dire that in many regions of the Russian Federation, according to Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, one-time payments to those signing contracts with the Russian army have been almost halved.
Against the backdrop of a federal budget deficit and worsening financial problems, one-time payments for those who signed contracts with the army have been reduced in the following regions. In Bashkiria, from 1.6 million rubles to 1 million. In the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, from 3.1 million to 1.9 million. In Belgorod Oblast, payments have dropped from 3 million to 800,000, and in Nizhny Novgorod Oblast, from 3 million to 1.5 million rubles.
In July, the EU introduced its 18th package of sanctions and lowered the price cap on Russian oil from $60 to $47.6 per barrel. As a result, according to Bloomberg, Russia's oil revenues fell by a third in the second month of summer. And although only the Kremlin knows the real state and deficit of the budget, it seems that the default of the Russian economy is not far off.
Forget technology and progress. In Russia, loyalty comes first. Patriotism, obedience, and love for Putin are the new school subjects. Now Russian authorities are considering a ban on mobile phones in school camps. Why? They say kids are getting too much Western influence from the internet. Is this about protecting children or controlling their minds? Let's break it down.
And the State Duma isn't sleeping on the job. This time they've decided to come up with a way to save children from the internet. Deputy Tatiana Butskaya has proposed banning mobile phones in children's camps in Russia.
It's a great country where the president cares so much about children.
The idea is simple. Less internet means more patriotism. Now the camp is turning not into a place for rest, but into a place for proper upbringing.
There are camps and then there are camps, as they say. I think nowadays you wouldn't go to just any camp with pleasure. Besides, camps these days are not a cheap pleasure. And especially if they ban phones, well, I don't know where today's teenager would go if they're not allowed to use a phone. The answer, nowhere. That's just not serious.
Budko explained her initiative simply. Parents complain that their children are constantly on their phones. So instead of coming up with interesting activities for the kids, they just decided to take away their gadgets.
Of course, kids don't want to listen to all this patriotism, but there's another reason to take away the phones. Yes, if children write to their parents, and this happens quite often, that something is wrong at the camp, like they're not being fed properly or something else is going on with them. And as a result, parents come, get upset, and even take their children out of the camp.
You'd think just let the child enjoy their childhood. But no. Now even camps are about control, discipline, and life without gadgets.
It's much easier to sell this to kids in such packaging, yes. That is, if you just drone on about important things in class, everyone will just tune it out. But if it's wrapped up nicely like this with songs around the campfire and all that, then you see it might sink in deeper. So it turns out that, just like in Soviet times, it's better to minimize a child's interaction with this state apparatus.
So it turns out that a phone at camp isn't just a toy but a window to reality. And that's exactly what officials fear the most, because there a child might see that the world is much broader than the state program for fostering patriotism.
Here, our problem isn't with phones and not even with the camps. And the real problem, in fact, lies with today's Russian government, with the current presidential administration, which is trying to build not even an ideological state, because this isn't about ideology, but rather a simple tyranny, a despotism, where the main thing they want to instill in children from the youngest age is that you must obey your superiors.
So that's how the state decided to save children from the internet, and adults can proudly say, "See, we protected you from TikTok and likes." But the question is, did the children themselves ask to be saved? But if you thought that was all, it's not. Now these important conversations will also reach kindergartens.
The Russian state will always wholeheartedly support you in all your endeavors and efforts so that you can truly be proud of your country, and your country in turn can be immensely proud of you and your achievements.
The Ministry of Education decided that children from 3 to 7 years old would be really interested in listening to monotonous conversations about important things lessons.
Well, let's imagine a child is 3 years old, and what are they going to explain to them? That you can walk up to the sandbox, smack another kid on the head, and take their toy mold? Is that what they're going to explain to him? Well, actually, parents might get a bit concerned about that. But if they're going to explain something else, that you shouldn't hit another kid on the head, you shouldn't take their toy mold, let them play with theirs and you play with yours. So then how, when they grow up, are you going to explain to them that it's okay to attack a neighboring country and try to take everything from it?
In kindergarten, talks about important things at camp, a life without phones. Total care for the children. Let them be bored, at least it's the right way.
Glory indeed to our beloved and cherished fatherland.
That's all for today on Ukraine Today. If you want the truth to keep coming, like, comment and subscribe. And most importantly, become a sponsor of our channel. Your support helps us stay independent and speak out when others stay silent. Support Ukrainian journalism that's fight for facts. Stay strong, stay informed and stay with Ukraine.